Okay, let's just dive right in. We've all been told a story about humanity, right? A very specific story.
The standard narrative.
Exactly. And it goes something like this. We start out as these simple, nomadic hunter-gatherers, all living in a kind of, primitive equality.
Right, the small bands roaming the plains.
Then boom, we invent farming. And that one step, that single invention, supposedly leads inevitably to everything else.
Hierarchy, private property, cities, states.
The whole modern world. And we're told that this was the trade-off. We had to give up some freedom to become civilized to get order and prosperity.
And it's more than just a story we tell in history class. It's a political justification. It's the cover story for why our world is the way it is.
How so?
Well, whether you think the state saved us from a life that was nasty, brutish, and short, or you think it ruined some kind of idyllic, innocent past.
The Hobbes versus Rousseau thing?
Precisely. The common thread is this deep sense of fatalism. It suggests there was only one path forward, that this was all unavoidable.
Okay. But what if that entire story, that straight line from primitive equality to complex inequality, is just fundamentally wrong?
It's spectacularly wrong, even.
What if we've been, for centuries, just wrong about humans? This deep dive is, it's an ambitious one. The book we're tackling is The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by the late David Graeber and David Wengrow.
And it really is one of the most ambitious scholarly works to come out in a long, long time. We're talking about a book that spans 30,000 years of human history.
So our mission today is to really get to the heart of its argument, which has shaken up, whole fields: anthropology, history, social theory.
We're going to try and distill the central critique and the really radical alternative they put forward. And this book, it's not some obscure academic text. It's been called a critique of Western thought, a manifesto. It's an international bestseller, won major awards.
And it positions itself as a direct challenge to a lot of the big history books that you see everywhere. You know the ones.
Oh, yeah. Books by people like Jared Diamond, Steven Pinker, Yuval Noah Harari.
And those narratives, as popular as they are, often lean into that fatalism we were talking about. They give you these deterministic explanations for why we have inequality. It was the geography or the climate or the technology.
Something outside of our control. Graeber and Wengrow want to deliver a massive shock to those kinds of just-so stories. They argue that by simplifying our history like that, we actually limit our own political imagination today.
So what's the core message then?
The core message is that human social structures were not driven by some inevitable force. They were driven by conscious choice, by political experimentation, and by an incredible amount of flexibility.
Okay, so here it is, the central aha moment for you, the listener. The big idea we're going to build on is this.
The way we live now, with permanent inequality, rigid bureaucracy, centralized power, this is not the necessary endpoint of a complex society.
We were never doomed to end up here. The past, they argue, is full of proof that human beings have always had agency. And if we had it then, we can have it now. We can consciously change our own societies. So to get our heads around that, we first have to tackle the two big, simple models that have always dominated this whole debate.
Right, the two stories that Western thinkers have been telling themselves for centuries. When you think about prehistory, you almost always fall into one of two camps.
The Rousseauvian and the Hobbesian views. Two sides, the same kind of misleading coin.
That's it, exactly. On the one hand, you have the Rousseauvian model, the idea of the noble savage.
Primitive life was simple, egalitarian, innocent.
Right. Everyone lived in these tiny free bands. It was a kind of golden age. And then farming comes along and ruins everything. It brings private property, patriarchy, the state, a glorious fall from grace.
And the Hobbesian model is just the polar opposite. If you don't buy the noble savage, you must believe in the violent one.
Correct. For Hobbes, the state of nature was a nightmare, a constant brutal war of all against all. Life was, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
And in that story, the state is the hero. The strong, despotic ruler is the only thing that can save us from our own violent nature.
But the whole point of The Dawn of Everything is that both of these stories are deeply flawed. They aren't real history. They're conservative myths, cover stories.
What do you mean by conservative?
Well, they're conservative in the sense that they limit our thinking. They effectively shut down any real intellectual exchange. They force early humans into these really rigid boxes.
You're either an angel or a devil.
History's angels or its devils, exactly. And that makes it impossible to see their actions or their political ideas as, serious, conscious choices made by intelligent people. They just become these passive specimens waiting for the laws of history to happen to them.
So if we throw out that binary, that whole fall from grace or leap to salvation narrative, where do we even start? What's the right question to ask about the last 30,000 years?
We have to reframe the question itself. The old question, what are the origins of social inequality, is a trap.
A trap.
Because it assumes there was some long, static period of perfect equality that we somehow lost. The evidence doesn't show that. The right question, according to the authors, is this. How did we get stuck?
Stuck.
How did we get stuck in one particular rigid form of social and political organization? Complexity and diversity, it turns out, have been with us from the start. The real mystery is our modern rigidity. Why did we lose our flexibility?
That sets up their biggest target perfectly. This myth of the agricultural trap.
Or the Neolithic trap, as they call it. This is the idea that once we started farming, the game was over. It was checkmate for freedom and agency.
And this is like cornerstone wisdom in academia, right? That farming inevitably created states, property, patriarchy.
It absolutely is. But the authors just dismantle it piece by piece with the evidence. First of all, agriculture wasn't some sudden revolution.
Right. Not an overnight switch.
Not at all. It was an incredibly slow, uneven process. Sometimes they call it low-level food production or even play farming. It took thousands of years to unfold in different ways in different places.
And they talk about societies that actually tried farming for a while, for centuries even, and then just stopped.
Yes. They consciously abandoned it.
That seems almost unbelievable to us now. Why would anyone give up a stable food supply?
Because they consciously chose other things instead. Things like leisure or freedom or political autonomy. They looked at the trade-offs and decided full-scale farming wasn't worth the price.
What was the price exactly? What were they rejecting?
They were rejecting the whole package that came with it. The rigid hierarchy, the intense labor discipline. The authors cite examples from places like Inner Asia where, adult men would stubbornly refuse to give up hunting and herding.
So they'd leave the farming to others.
They'd leave the limited gardening work to women or captives. They were willing to face lean years, even the risk of famine, rather than accept the political and cultural submission that came with being tied to the land under some rising elite.
It was a conscious political choice to stay free and mobile.
It reframes the entire thing. It wasn't a technological upgrade. It was a political decision with very high stakes. And the archaeology backs this up.
How so?
Well, we have this assumption that you only get big, complex societies and huge monuments after you have massive farming surpluses.
Right, because you need the surplus to feed the builders and support the kings.
But the record shows that's just not true. You see monumental architecture and even large settlements, early cities, really popping up without any evidence of large-scale agriculture or a permanent ruling class.
Wow.
What's more, some of the very first farming communities, say, in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago, they were remarkably free of ranks and central authority for thousands of years. The main point here is there was no original form of human society. The complexity and diversity have always been there, which just shatters that whole linear model.
Okay, let's shift to what might be the most controversial argument in the book. The one that really rewrites the history of the Western world.
I think I know where you're going.
We're all taught that big ideas like freedom, equality, human rights, they were born in the European Enlightenment. Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire.
Great European thinkers sitting in their studies thinking great thoughts.
Right. But Graeber and Wengrow argue that the foundations of modern Western thought weren't purely European at all. They were fundamentally shaped by indigenous North American thinkers.
This is what they call the Indigenous Critique. And the argument is just profound. They claim that the whole structure of social evolution, those rigid stages from hunter-gatherer to farmer to commerce, was invented by Europeans after this critique arrived in Europe.
Wait, so it wasn't a historical theory?
It was a political defense mechanism. It was a way to shield European society from a devastating intellectual attack.
So Enlightenment thinkers weren't just creating ideas about liberty out of thin air. They were reacting to something.
They were reacting to a shock wave from the New World. The book basically suggests that some of these core concepts of modern political thought couldn't even have been fully imagined by European theorists until their minds were pollinated by Native American philosophy.
A shock to the system.
Exactly. It revealed possibilities for how to organize a society that European thinkers, who were just so steeped in hereditary monarchy and religious dogma, had assumed were impossible.
And the key figure in this whole intellectual drama is a Wendid statesman named Kandiaronk.
Kandiaronk, who the French ironically called the Rat, was an extraordinary figure. He was a famous warrior, a brilliant diplomat. He was a key signatory of the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. But more than that, he was a philosophical genius.
And the French recognized this.
Oh, absolutely. French governors were so blown away by his intellect that they would invite him to their salons for philosophical debates in the late 1600s. This is before the Enlightenment really gets going.
And we have a record of these debates.
The main source they use is a book from 1703 called Dialogues Curieux, written by a French aristocrat, Baron de la Hontan, who was himself pretty skeptical of French society, and in it, he records Kandiaronk's critique.
What was the core of that critique? What did he find so wrong with French society?
It was a total surgical takedown. He found their obsession with money to be just bizarre and contemptible. He couldn't understand why anyone would live without shared resources or basic personal freedom. He thought their inequality was completely irrational.
Let's double-click on that point about money and property.
Kandiaronk saw that money made Europeans act against their own best interests, against logic. He famously asked, if the French king is so powerful and rich, why are all his subjects so poor?
Good question.
He argued that the pursuit of personal profit created this endless, miserable cycle of anxiety and exploitation. For him, money wasn't a tool for prosperity. It was the root of all evil. It made people lie, steal, betray each other. It made genuine generosity impossible.
That is a profoundly different worldview. And he also went after their legal system and their whole idea of obedience, right?
Absolutely. He was horrified by the idea of being a slavish subject of a king, of obeying someone just because of their title, even if they were cruel or incompetent. He thought their whole system of courts and prisons was just ridiculous.
Why?
He couldn't understand why you would need to formalize punishment and brutality when you could just solve problems through mutual aid and public debate. The Jesuit missionaries who were trying to convert indigenous peoples, they were always writing home in frustration.
About what?
They'd complain that native peoples, even when you asked them nicely, simply wouldn't obey commands.
That is a massive point. The whole European system was built on the idea that obedience is natural and necessary.
And for Kandiaronk's society and many others, the freedom to disobey an unreasonable order was a fundamental part of human dignity.
So these critiques, recorded by Lahontan, they get back to Europe and become a bestseller.
A huge bestseller. And these ideas start to circulate, creating this intellectual ferment. They force thinkers like Rousseau and Montesquieu to even ask questions about the origin of inequality for the first time. They were now grappling with a real-world example of a complex society that rejected all of their most basic assumptions.
But we have to touch on the academic debate here. How do we know Lahontan wasn't just putting words in Kandiaronk's mouth, using him as a mouthpiece for his own views?
That is the crucial question. Some scholars, like Charles Mann, argue that the speeches attributed to Kandiaronk are very consistent with what we know about his historical style and his other recorded speeches. They see it as a mostly faithful record.
And the other side.
Others argue that the character in the book, Adario, is more of a hybridized rhetorical construction, that Lahontan, who was a known skeptic of the church and the state, used him as a vehicle to voice his own criticisms of European society.
But even if that's true, even if it's filtered, the core argument from Graeber and Wengrow still stands, right? That these powerful ideas were fundamentally external to Europe.
Precisely. The critique wasn't just invented out of thin air in a Paris salon, and the tragedy is what happened next. This intellectual exchange didn't lead to some great dialogue. It led to a defense, a backlash.
This is where the stage theory of history comes in.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
That linear story hunter-gatherer to farmer to commercial society. It was formalized and weaponized after the Indigenous Critique hit Europe.
To do what?
To dismiss it. It served a political purpose. It allowed European thinkers to say, oh, that's very interesting, that indigenous freedom you talk about, but that's just a feature of a primitive stage of history. It's quaint, but it's irrelevant to us because we're a superior commercial civilization.
It stripped them of their political agency.
It redefined their entire worldview as just a byproduct of how they got their food. It wasn't conscious political philosophy anymore. It was just hunter-gatherer innocence. It was a way to win the argument by changing the rules.
Which brings us to the hard evidence, the archaeology, because the book is packed with it.
Yeah.
And it's all aimed at overturning that idea that lots of people living together inevitably requires a king and a police force.
Right. If you don't need a centralized state just because you have a city, what does that complexity actually look like?
And North America, ironically, provides some of the best examples. Let's start with Poverty Point in Louisiana.
Poverty Point is an incredible site. We're talking about 3,600 years ago. It has these monumental, massive earthworks, huge concentric ridges, giant mounds covering more than 500 acres. This was an ancient city.
But the key is who built it.
Exactly. It was built by people who were, for all intents and purposes, hunter-gatherers. There's no evidence of large-scale farming or a rigid, permanent hierarchy.
So a monumental society built by foragers. That just completely blows up the Neolithic trap idea. So how did they organize the labor to build those giant mounds? Was there a pharaoh commanding them?
It doesn't look like it. There are no palaces, no royal tombs, no signs of a highly stratified elite. It seems to have been a complex but decentralized society, probably organized around seasonal gatherings, shared rituals, and consensus. The labor was massive and coordinated, but not necessarily coercive.
Persuasion, not command.
It seems so. It shows that large-scale projects are possible without the threat of state violence.
Okay, then there's the Calusa Kingdom in Florida. Another key piece of evidence.
Indeed. The Calusa were also a complex, sedentary, even a stratified society, but they weren't farmers. Their entire subsistence was based on the incredible bounty of the sea. They were sophisticated coastal foragers.
And yet they had a kingdom.
They had political specialists. They fielded large military forces. They built enormous shell mounds. They proved that you can have high social complexity, stratification, even war, completely independent of agriculture. It just shatters that old assumption.
So if you can have complexity and even some hierarchy, but it's not permanent or inevitable, how do these societies manage power? This gets us to one of the book's most fascinating concepts, this idea of political oscillation.
This is the core evidence for human agency and flexibility. Graeber and Wengrow talk about a phenomenon called double morphology.
Okay, what is that?
It's where a society consciously and predictably shifts its entire social structure with the seasons.
You mean they change their form of government every year?
In a way, yes. For part of the year, say, when they were dispersed for foraging, they would live in small, very egalitarian bands, almost no leadership at all. But then, during a season of abundance, like a big salmon run or a harvest, they would all come together.
What happened then?
They would coalesce into a large, much more hierarchical gathering. They'd have chiefs, rituals, maybe even police forces of a sort.
So they would literally choose to become hierarchical for a few months and then choose to go back to being egalitarian.
Exactly. It proves that command structures, when they used them, were seen as a tool. A conscious, temporary, removable choice. Not a permanent burden you were stuck with forever. It's real political creativity. They're choosing the right tool for the job.
And the other mechanism they talk about for maintaining this flexibility is gizmogenesis. That's a mouthful.
It is, but the idea is pretty straightforward. It's a process where societies define themselves in opposition to their neighbors. It's active political differentiation.
So if your neighbor builds a big authoritarian state,
You might intentionally choose to become radically decentralized and egalitarian just to not be like them. If they value strict obedience, you'll value radical personal freedom. It's politics driven by ideology and conscious contrast.
can we see that in the archaeological record?
Absolutely. You see it in the Americas after the collapse of big states like the classic Maya, and later around major centers like Cahokia. Many Native American groups seem to have deliberately rejected the centralized authoritarian models they saw.
They saw the alternative and said, no, thank you.
Pretty much. They chose decentralization, councils, consensus, and endless debate because they saw the alternative as a failed experiment. Their history was a political conversation, not a march of progress.
Which brings us back to Cahokia, that huge city near modern-day St. Louis. It clearly had hierarchy. The book uses its decline as a case study in choice, but I know this point has faced some criticism.
It has. The argument in The Dawn of Everything is really powerful. It says that when Cahokia declined in the 14th century, the people who left deliberately reorganized themselves into what they call tribal republics. They consciously rejected the authoritarianism of the city.
An immediate political choice to be free.
That's the narrative.
Yeah.
But critics push back on the timeline.
How so?
They argue that the development of those decentralized councils and republics happened much later, maybe 3 or 4 centuries after Cahokia fell. And more importantly, that this shift wasn't just an internal choice, but was probably a response to the trauma of European invasion and disease.
So it muddies the water between a conscious rejection of tyranny and a pragmatic response to a catastrophe.
Right. It shows just how difficult it is to interpret these huge spans of time with certainty.
Before we move on from this, let's circle back to property. The book makes a really crucial distinction between ancient ideas of property and our modern ones.
This is one of the most mind-bending parts of the book, I think. Property isn't a new idea, it's ancient. But what it meant was fundamentally different. It was often linked to responsibility, to stewardship.
Can you give an example?
Sure. If you belong to, say, the Bear Clan, you might be said to own the bears. But that didn't mean you could kill them all. It meant you had an obligation to protect them, to perform the right rituals, to ensure they weren't overhunted. Ownership was a duty.
And inequality, when it existed, wasn't about owning more stuff.
Not necessarily. It was often about who had control over sacred knowledge or ritual objects or leadership roles. It wasn't about accumulating land or material wealth in the way we think of it.
But the Roman legal tradition, which is the one we inherited, is the complete opposite of that.
It completely inverted the logic. Roman law, and our law today, defines ownership dominium as the absolute right to control, to use, and critically, the right to damage or even destroy what you own. Its main feature is the right to exclude others.
So it's about separation, not obligation.
Exactly. And this radical, absolute, exclusionary idea of property slowly spread from being about, sacred objects to being about everything. Land, water, tools, people. It fundamentally rewired social logic from one of mutual responsibility to one of personal domination.
The whole perspective here, that history is a story of lost creativity, not inevitable progress. It forces us to ask that question you posed earlier.
Yeah.
How did we get so stuck?
And the authors argue it's because we gradually lost what they call the 3 primordial freedoms.
Okay, let's break these down. These are concrete political abilities that they say were common for most of human history.
And which modern states have systematically stamped out.
What's the first one?
The first is the freedom to move away, the power of exit.
The ability to just leave.
To just pack up and leave an unjust or unpleasant community with the full knowledge that you would be welcomed somewhere else. This was based on really strong, widespread norms of hospitality and asylum.
And what's the political effect of that freedom?
It's the ultimate accountability mechanism. It's a non-violent check on power. If a leader became a tyrant or tried to exploit people, their community would just melt away. People would vote with their feet.
So leaders had to rule by persuasion, not coercion.
They had no choice. If you can leave at any time, authority has to be constantly earned. It can't be institutionalized.
Okay, second freedom.
The freedom to disobey. This is the ability to simply ignore an arbitrary order without facing systematic formal punishment.
It's not anarchy.
No, not at all. It just means that authority depends on voluntary agreement and influence, not on having a police force and prisons to back you up. We saw this with Kandiaronk's critique. The Jesuits shocked that people simply wouldn't obey commands.
And this wasn't just in the New World.
Not at all. Tacitus wrote about the ancient Germans that their leaders were heard more because he has influence to persuade than because he has power to command. If people can just ignore you without consequence, your power is pretty conditional.
And the third freedom is what allows for all that experimentation we saw in the archaeology.
Yes. The freedom to reimagine and reconstruct society. The ability for a community to collectively and consciously change its own rules.
By going from hierarchical to egalitarian and back again.
Exactly. It explains double morphology. It explains schismogenesis. It shows that people saw their own social order as a project, as something they could build and rebuild, not as a fixed stage in an evolutionary ladder.
So the loss of these 3 freedoms is the great tragedy that got us stuck.
Yeah.
And the authors link it all back to the collapse of that first freedom, the freedom to move.
Yes, they draw on the work of an anthropologist named Franz Steiner. He argued that the first step towards domination and servitude was the collapse of hospitality.
The loss of the freedom to find asylum elsewhere.
Right. Suddenly, you have a population of unmoored people, refugees, runaways, exiles, people with nowhere else to go.
They've lost their exit option.
Exactly. And that vulnerable population can then be subjugated. You can force them to obey because they have no alternative. The loss of the freedom to move away paves the way for the loss of the freedom to disobey. And once you've normalized that kind of domination over one group, it can eventually be extended to everyone.
That structural analysis really elevates this from just a history book into something much more, a political manifesto, almost. But a book this big, covering this much ground, it was bound to get some serious pushback.
Oh, for sure. And to be clear, the book has been widely praised. People have called it brilliant, inspiring, exhilarating. Most agree it's a necessary challenge to our bedrock assumptions about history. Slap in our collective face, as one reviewer put it.
But there are some significant methodological criticisms from other academics.
Right. The main one centers on their style of argument. They're accused of cherry-picking, of selecting the most dramatic examples that fit their thesis while maybe not engaging as rigorously with evidence that complicates it.
And they don't always follow standard academic conventions.
No, and they do that on purpose. But critics point out that they often use words like imagine or it seems plausible to fill in gaps in the record, which makes for a compelling story, but some scholars worry it risks creating new myths while trying to tear down old ones.
And there's also a deeper philosophical critique about their aversion to materialist explanations.
This is a really important point. Materialist history, which is what a lot of the big history books are based on, emphasizes things like environment and technology, the mode of production, as the main driver of history.
The idea that agriculture caused inequality because it created a food surplus.
Exactly. And Graeber and Wengrow reject that kind of determinism. They're criticized for having an allergy to ecological thinking, for always emphasizing conscious political debate over material constraints.
And the counter-argument is that by doing that, they make it harder to see any patterns in history at all.
Right. Though their defense would be that those materialist categories, hunter-gatherer, farmer, are themselves Eurocentric inventions that wrongly lump together thousands of wildly different societies.
And when you're synthesizing this much data, some specific factual errors are bound to creep in.
Inevitably. A famous example that reviewers jumped on was a claim they make that modern American office workers work more hours overall than medieval European serfs.
That's a pretty dramatic claim.
It is. But when critics looked at the source they cited, it turned out the original study was only talking about adult male laborers, not serfs, and only the hours they spent in the fields. It didn't account for all the other work serfs had to do. It kind of undermined that specific contrast.
Which highlights the difficulty of a project this big. But despite these debates, the goal of the book was never really to be the final word on history, was it?
Not at all. The authors were very open about that. They hoped it would spark years of research and debate. David Wengrow has called the book a toolkit for reimagining our political options. Its ultimate purpose is political.
It's an attack on political fatalism.
It's an attack on Margaret Thatcher's infamous line, "There is no alternative, Tina."
Right. The idea that global capitalism, the nation-state bureaucracy, that this is the only way things can be.
Exactly. The Dawn of Everything is a 700-page rebuttal to Tina. It's a catalog of alternatives, proving that for most of our history, we've been endlessly creative and we're never stuck with just one or two options.
So let's bring it home. What does this all mean for us right now, living in this very rigid world? If we stop believing that inequality and hierarchy are the inevitable price of civilization, what does that change?
It changes everything. It puts human agency back at the center of the story. The systems we live under, they're not our destiny. They are historical artifacts. They are the result of specific choices and lost freedoms. They are not inevitable. We are not stuck.
The book is essentially trying to remind us that we have the power to intervene, to reconfigure our own societies, because the historical record shows that's what humans have always done.
It's a source book for political possibility. It's trying to help us reclaim those three primordial freedoms: the freedom to move, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to create new social forms.
So here's the final thought to leave you with. If the archaeology proves that for millennia, human beings, even in big, complex cities, routinely and successfully experimented with radically different ways of living, what fundamental capacity have we lost in the modern age? And how might regaining that capacity, that freedom to collectively reimagine our entire society, be the only real solution to the problems we face today?
That is the essential question. The book turns the past not into a finished story, but into a vast archive of forgotten possibilities, challenging us to be as bold and as creative as our ancestors were.